If you want to make an imaginary animal, if you want to make a mythical creature, just take a regular animal and add wings to it. Horse becomes Pegasus. A lion becomes a griffin. And a hawk becomes a double hawk.
Are you ready, though?
I'm not ready.
All right, great. In that case, we can begin this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy. I am here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony. I think just made his first ever tier list Maddox.
You made me do one before about cooking stuff, but I just did it in the Notes app. So I think that doesn't count.
Yeah, okay, that's true. I did make you do that before. So maybe your second ever tier list, but this one I made you do on tiermaker.com, where all tier lists live.
I did it. It was great. I moved all the little squares around. You love to move around the little squares.
It is fun.
Love to make memes.
It's not a meme.
Everything is a meme now.
No, you're the president of the Not Everything's a Meme brigade, so
I know.
You can't be calling this a meme. The tier list I made Anthony fill out is one I just created for all of the evergreen keyword abilities in Magic, the ones that apply to creatures. Apparently, Equip is a keyword ability that's evergreen, even though...
Yeah, I mean, it gets weird when you talk about language about Magic, because there's so many words that just have special meaning that we take for granted, like target. Target has so much meaning in Magic, and you have to understand what it means to understand Magic cards. Or don't. I guess it's kind of like English. But yeah, you just want to talk about all the things that you stick onto a creature to make it no longer a vanilla creature. Yeah. To make it a French vanilla creature.
Yeah, I'll read the ones we're going to talk about in this episode. And the point of this episode is that we just both ranked them, and we're going to argue about our subjective rankings of these keywords. So we think it's a good...
What if we don't? What if they're exactly the same, and this is like a 10-minute episode?
I mean, honestly, if that's the case, it's a 10-minute episode, and we're just stopping recording.
Okay.
It's that unlikely. I'm going to read through the effects we're going to be discussing in alphabetical order. I'm not spoiling my tier list order. They are Death Touch, Defender, Double Strike, First Strike, Flash, Flying, Haste, Hexproof, Indestructible, Lifelink, Menace, Protection, Reach, Trample, Vigilance, and Ward. And at the end, I'm going to make us each put Prowess in there somewhere too. It's not actually an evergreen keyword ability, it's Deciduous or whatever, but I have a soft spot for Prowess, and I want to hear about where we each put it. Spoiler alert, we completely forgot to do this.
It's been evergreen in the past.
It has been evergreen in the past. This was inspired by a recent little group that formed in the MTG Cube Talk Discord that is the Vigilance Haters.
A coup, would you call it? Or a splinter?
They're not overthrowing anything, but they have decided that they're don't
fomenting.
Like Vigilance, and that too many people like Vigilance, and there's, I don't know, some interesting conversation to be had around what Vigilance means as a keyword ability and what it actually does to games. And I thought we might as well have that conversation about all the keywords at once, Anthony. I'm a notorious life gain disliker, so where am I going to put lifelink? We're going to find out on this very episode. Now, we should say these rankings are completely subjective. This is what Anthony and I think. You are welcome to argue about it in the comments. In fact, I hope you do. I will probably not engage, but there's no objective way you can measure these mechanics.
Disengagement farming here?
Disengagement farming. I'm farming my own disengagement with your engagement. Look, the point is, these are not objective. This is just what Anthony and I think about these mechanics. And I think we're going to disagree a fair bit. I think we should work from the bottom up. Just the worst mechanics, by our measure, up to the best mechanics. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, that makes sense to me.
Okay. I added an F tier to this list. Does F tier show up for you, or does it not show up for you?
I don't see an F tier, but I'm going to be honest. You know I love to give caveats and qualifications and all kinds of bullshit.
Waiting for this, yeah.
And so my point is just that I recognize that a lot of these keywords serve a purpose, even if it's just they are good in very, very small doses or
I refuse to recognize this.
Very particular contexts. So I would give none of these an F. So even if it was here, no Fs for me.
Great. So none in the F tier for you. I have 2 in the F tier.
Oh no. Can I guess?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm gonna guess Protection.
Actually, no.
Okay. Well then I have no idea. Hexproof?
Hexproof and Indestructible are my 2 in F tier.
Okay.
I think these mechanics suck. I don't like things not being interactive, and we'll get to Ward later, but I think with Ward in existence, I don't see why you would ever bother having these, right? Like, Ward 4 is basically hexproof for all intents and purposes. Indestructible is a little different because it plays with board wipes and things that don't target, and also combat, obviously. But, you know, I think good Magic is interactive Magic, and obviously we can give all the caveats. I know why they did this, right? There were reasons why they printed these mechanics. I'm not saying I never would have printed them.
Because sometimes you just want to feel safe. You just want to have your little guy and have them be safe.
I'm not saying I never would have printed these mechanics if I were in WotC's shoes or anything. I'm just saying that as it stands right now, I'd be shocked if I ever put any card with indestructible or hexproof in any of my cubes.
So, indestructible does open up some interesting design space. We are just talking about these keywords.
What, stuffy doll and nothing else?
I was gonna think of a second example. Give me a second. Stuffy doll and Darksteel Relic. There we go. Those are two great examples.
That is interesting design space in the sense that, like,
a French vanilla artifact.
Yeah, in the way that, like, a Twinkie is an interesting patisserie, I guess.
I think it's even less than that. It's more like in the way the bits that after you make tempura left over are interesting patisserie. I also think these keywords, obviously, they don't just go on creatures. You also get combat tricks that are going to grant temporary effects or an equipment that's going to grant an effect. And I think especially in those contexts, some of these things that are less fun when you don't have to work for them, when you're just playing a creature that just has indestructible all the time, not so great. If it actually makes you work for it in some way by jumping through some hoops, then these mechanics start to be a lot more useful. And if we're going to have them in some capacity, then sure, every once in a while print a 4-mana 2/2 indestructible just so players kind of like have an on-ramp to learning what these keywords do.
Okay, yeah, sure. I did evaluate these as keywords on creatures.
Yeah.
Obviously, having a word to describe cannot be destroyed is very helpful for things that say, this thing's indestructible to end of turn. So no shade on indestructible in that context. I'll probably still throw some shade at hexproof. I do have some things that grant temporary hexproof in the 100 Ornithopters cube specifically. Actually, mostly as a answer to a lot of the board wipes, because a lot of the board wipes in that cube say target creature and all other creatures with the same name as that creature. And so you can effectively foil a board wipe with a Snakeskin Veil or whatever, which I think is actually very cool that it works differently in that way. But I even don't love it there, so I don't know. I'm sticking by my guns. Hexproof, indestructible, F tier.
I mean, I really don't love what they've been doing. The sort of way that they've styled a lot of abilities that are like mass pump effects, where I feel like increasingly it's like, oh, all your lands turn into creatures, and they get haste and vigilance, and also they get indestructible till end of turn. It's like, make me make a choice here. Make me risk something. I feel like those like mass pumps, I don't love when they throw indestructible on those all the time.
I agree. If you're making the power and toughness bigger or whatever, don't bother.
Just get in there.
Make him swing.
Make it risky.
Honestly, part of me wonders if, I don't want to speculate too much, but I do kind of wonder if a lot of that just is like, okay, they're effectively indestructible, but now the person on defense is like trying to bend over backwards to arrange some series of blocks that it benefits them, and actually it's just easier if we make it what we do want it to be. Like, it's actually simpler if they are all indestructible because you don't have to think about it anymore. I like simple game pieces, but not in that way.
All right, so
that's
you're
my
F tier, hexproof, indestructible. I agree with you about Ward. I feel like I do appreciate the simplicity of hexproof, of just cannot be targeted, but giving them some out, like, okay, I can do this if I get to some very large amount of mana. It's not affecting the gameplay in a huge way in most cases, but does make things feel not totally hopeless.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the difference between printing like an 06 wall and a 0100 wall. Like, in most cases, it's not going to matter. Or in this case, an O infinity wall, right? You can literally never do anything about it.
You mean Dreamfighter or Fogbank?
Sure, Dreamfighter or Fogbank.
I'm just having fun naming old cards here.
We're just having a great time. It's a good time to remind people that we do have a cards mention page for every episode of the podcast. So if you want to see the fun cards Anthony is naming, you can go to our website or check the show notes and find the page that will show all of these cards visually in a spoiler in chronological order, so you can follow along. Those are the only two I put in F tier, though, as solidly irredeemable. I have 5 in D tier, which are mechanics that I strongly dislike, but will sometimes use sparingly, or will sometimes cop to the fact that there is an opportunity for interesting designs with them. But they're my big dislike category.
I also... Oh, wait, sorry, you said D tier?
Yeah.
Oh, man. I think maybe my rating scale is just... I was like, oh, yeah, me too, but that's my C tier. I only put one thing in D tier.
That's fine. Let's do your one thing in D tier first.
Okay, my one thing in D tier, which I already mentioned, is protection. Protection, similar stuff, like I think it makes a lot of sense sometimes when you're granting as a temporary effect. Just throwing it on a creature that has protection all the time is just not great magic, and it's also very complicated in so many ways. Protection is not just one ability in more than one way. It is like a series of abilities. It can be protection from a color is kind of the most common we think of, or protection from instants, protection from a permanent type. And then also, protection means a lot of different things at the same time. It means, can I even remember it? It can't be damaged by, targeted by, destroyed, or...
It can be destroyed by a thing that's not that color. It's
damaged, target,
it's enchanted,
blocked,
it's enchanted, blocked.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because Wrath of God still gets around protection.
Correct.
But X damage to all creatures, protection will prevent that. So it's like, it's both complicated and it sort of seems intuitive, but then you actually get into the weeds very quickly with it. I feel like it gets justified some way where something just needs a little bit of a power boost, so they give it protection from something that's a little bit narrow. But overall, not my favorite mechanic. If I have to put something at the bottom of the list, easily protection.
This is at the bottom of my D tier, so it is the one I like the least in D tier, just right edging out of F tier. And the reason I didn't put it all the way in F tier is because specifically I think protection from things like instants or protection from creatures or things like that, I think has a lot more depth and interest to it. If it was just purely protection from a color, then I would probably have it down there in F tier with everything else, just a coin flip whether this matters or not in this matchup, and when it does matter, it's broken. But the other kinds of protections they've been doing where they care about a specific subset of things, I think, can be interesting.
They can be. They also get kind of hairy, though. Like, what's the Shauna Sisei's Legacy is a card that...
Protection from abilities.
Protection from abilities. So it's like, oh, well, I can destroy this with my Lightning Bolt, but I can't destroy it with my Banishing Light for some reason. Oops.
Well, I have 4 more things in D tier.
Okay.
Working up, my next least favorite mechanic, so just above protection, is Defender. Defender sucks. It is obvious to me why Richard Garfield made it in Alpha. It's one of the first things I probably would have thought of as well. Like, oh, what if there's just a wall between me and my opponent's creatures instead of another creature? I just find that fundamentally they lead to almost never interesting play patterns. And I remember a very specific level up I had when I was getting better at the game and learning more about Cube, where I was talking to somebody, I think probably on the MTG Cube Talk Discord or somewhere on some online fora, and I was saying like, oh, Wall of Blossoms is so great against aggro, and they were like, what's actually just as good most of the time is Elvish Visionary, because then you actually get to kill one of the things instead of just blocking one for a while until they use a burn spell to remove your blocker or whatever. That was a kind of interesting level up moment for me where it's like, oh yeah, you don't need walls to actually be good against attackers. You can just use your other attackers, and then that's a much more flexible game piece that can also then attack them back.
I mean, you could also just say, like, here's Wall of Blossoms, it's an 0/4. Attacking with it doesn't do anything, but maybe later in the game you put a +1/+1 counter on it.
You don't even have to give it Defender,
like,
that's
great.
true. Yeah. I struggle to think of an interesting card design with Defender, except for the ones that can selectively lose it. And it's like, okay, well, it's only interesting because it can lose Defender, and then it actually becomes somewhat dynamic. But I think if they were to run back Magic from the start, like clear all the card file, Men in Black, hit everybody with that laser and make them forget the whole game, but remember all the lessons they learned, I don't think they would design Defender again.
Okay, first of all, that's not how the little clicky thing worked. I don't know. I think that Magic, as Richard Garfield intended, was a lot of walls.
It
Alpha
was.
is full of walls, and I feel like that sort of set a different sort of tempo for how the game worked at that point, where it was much more about like building up your defenses and constructing your plan out of artifacts. And
at the kitchen table, maybe, but they were never competitive viable. So to say that it was a big part of Magic is only superficially true, because they were not a part of competitive Magic basically ever. Go ahead and tell me in the comments where I'm wrong.
Competitive
Plume
Magic
Veil was played in competitive Magic, but that was not Alpha, obviously, and that was much later.
Competitive Magic was also not necessarily a big part of Magic. Like, the kitchen table experience was very much what was the focus of early Magic, in terms of the way it was designed.
Sure. I don't know.
I don't have the same ire against Defender, partly because I think protection and hexproof can lead to these like frustrating moments. I think aside from that like moment of like, oh, I can't put my sword on my Wall of Blossoms and attack, Defender is kind of harmless. It's like very descriptive. It tells somebody what the cards are going to do, that you can have this strategy that is more about defense than offense, and that really opens up the doors to thinking about Magic as serving multiple different roles and decks having multiple different strategies. And there are a lot of edge cases.
The thing is, Defender just can't have multiple different. They only have the one strategy, which is block. You could just put a creature without Defender in it, and then your deck can't have multiple different strategies.
Think of all the possibilities of all the things you can do while your opponent's creatures are blocked.
You can just block your opponent's creatures with your own non-defenders.
I don't want to be safe behind some little 1/1. I want to be safe behind a safe wall.
Print the 0/4 without Defender, then. I recognize the significance of the mechanic in early days of Magic. I also think it is one of the most resonant, obvious mechanics just from the name, and there's some merit to that, but Still, you put it all in a blender, I still think it's a bad mechanic. Bottom of D tier for me, right above protection. I don't think anyone will guess what my next one above this is.
I mean, I'm surprised that we haven't hit lifelink yet. So,
we haven't hit lifelink yet. Is Death Touch.
Okay.
I hate Death Touch. I think Death Touch leads to more board stalls and awful, drudgy, unfun games than any of the other mechanics on this list. And part of this is because of how it's used, right? Like, theoretically, Death Touch, in the way it's mechanically written, doesn't have to contribute to this, but what you actually get all the time are little tiny creatures with Death Touch, which basically serve as like on-board removal spells, basically, where it's like, it's an on-board, Valorous Stance, or not Valorous Stance, Gideon's Reproach, where like, if you attack me, you're going to lose one of your attackers, whenever you do, because I have this on-board removal spell. I think there's a time and place for on-board stuff adding to strategic depth, and I think this is the far end of the other spectrum in terms of on-board things just eliminating decisions and making things completely unfun. I hate Death Touch.
I don't disagree with anything that you're saying. I feel like when I hit Death Touch, that really, when I was making my rankings, that really started making me think about sort of the role of all of these keywords and the fact that actually all of them kind of suck when you hit a certain volume, with a few exceptions. And Death Touch is one of those where it's like, if you have one or two in a limited set, it's like, okay, cool. This is adding a little bit of texture,
cool?
Because now a small thing can take down a big thing, and so it just that sort of cascades in like the kinds of board decisions you're making and the kinds of drafts you're building, and how you're choosing to actually use that Death Touch blocker, or maybe I'm going to combine that with a fight spell, or there is a lot that it opens up in sort of the play space, but I feel like you hit that threshold where it goes from a little bit of interesting texture, a little bit of nice spice in a set, to this really isn't fun anymore because it actually is just doing what you're describing of creating this big board stall.
Yeah.
So,
and I don't even think the first one is particularly interesting, honestly. Like, give me a Bone Splinters or a Bone Shards if you want a small thing to destroy a big thing, or give the creature an ability to sacrifice to destroy something big. Like,
but isn't it more fun to be able to like have that level up?
I'm literally saying I think it is not fun at all. To like, the one cool thing you can do with Death Touch, which I think is cool only like once, is the creatures with Death Touch, and you get like putting a lure on it, where it's like all creatures must block this creature.
Yeah,
with Able.
That's cool.
There was one limited retail set.
Or what about a pinger?
Again, like, it's cool in the way that, like, building an EDH deck is cool. Where look at what these cards do together. But then, just like EDH, playing the game sucks. That's exactly what these mechanics do.
That's partly what I mean. It's like, it's fun in very small doses. You don't want it to be coming up all the time.
Like, as a player, yes, if I get to do that, cool. As a cube designer, no, I don't want anyone doing that in any game of any environment I've ever shaped.
Let's write this down. Death Touch Cube.
I mean...
Wait, let's just call this Andy's least favorite cube. There we go. Writing that down. Claiming that slug on Cube Cobra right now.
The other thing is, you'll notice a pattern here of the mechanics I like the least, and they're mechanics that just make attacking awful and blocking really good. And
have you ever attacked with a creature with Death Touch?
Yes, it's so much worse attacking.
Grave Titan.
It's
why does
so much worse when attacking, because then it's like, it's just so much worse than attacking.
Well, what about,
like, it's the difference between a removal spell and an edict, like when you're talking about Death Touch attacking versus blocking.
Okay, but didn't you really like, is it the new Tiny Bones that has like a Saboteur effect with Death Touch, so you want to...
I didn't really like it.
You didn't like it, okay.
I thought it was kind of interesting to have a 1-drop that had upside, but I didn't even get it to test. Check the results of the survey. You will see that I do not care about Tiny Bones. Anyway, continuing on a theme, still in D tier, 2 left, my next least favorite mechanic is Reach. I don't think we need Reach. We don't need Death Touch, don't need Defender. I don't think we need Reach. This is another one where I've had this conversation a couple times with people on like the Cube Talk Discord, where they're like, I have a lot of flyers, and green needs a way to deal with flyers, and green has no removal, so I should give a bunch of Reach to my green section. And it's like, well, first of all, I think flying should be good, and if every color has a suitable number of answers to flying, then flying's not good anymore. It's just, you've neutralized it with another set of things. So I'm totally fine with green having a weakness to flyers. And B, green's creatures are bigger. Just race. Just attack them back. Like, there are other ways you can combat having a creature with flying, and I think Reach is the least elegant way. But what if your opponent has a creature
with flying and an 0/4 wall? What are you going to do?
I mean, get good, scrub.
That's what I'm saying.
Reach, poo-poo butt.
All right, I'm just gonna not talk about Reach again until we get to my S tier.
It's fine. Totally fine. Last one in my D tier here. It's at the top of D tier. It's right on the edge of C tier, but it is lifelink. I've spoken a lot about this before, and I just think that what lifelink does to combat math and to the race is a huge bummer. I find some of the most fun games of Magic are ones where players really commit to a line and make sacrifices to pursue a particular strategy in a game. And so often, repeatable life gain just completely cuts off a lot of avenues of a lot of decks to close out games. It removes so many outs that they could top deck. It just completely shuts things down. And this is, again, my subjective taste. I like aggro. I like my games quick. I like my games decisive. I don't like the long, drawn-out games that go to turn 40, and you have to worry about both of you decking, and, it's a giant board stall. So that's where I'm going to put it. There are some cards with lifelink that I do enjoy. They do exist. I have been more lax on lifelink in other cubes that are not the Bun Magic cube, not my primary Eternal cube. There's more of it in the Neoclassical cube, for example. There's quite a bit of repeatable life gain in the Ornithopters cube, coincidentally. So I'm not fully off it, but it's one of my least favorite mechanics.
I don't disagree. I feel like lifelink to me is very polarizing, and it really, really depends on the individual cards. I've had so many games where it's like, okay, this is a tight race, and then my opponent has a 4/4 with lifelink, and it's just like, okay, this game is kind of over, and that I don't really see how I can ever win this race except by drawing a removal spell in the next 2 turns. But it's not like a race that has a clear end. It's just like, your life is going to keep going up, and mine's going to maybe go down slowly or not at all. And that sort of feeling of a lack of structure, or lack of making a coherent plan against it can be very frustrating. Similar to Death Touch, enjoy lifelink, especially on small creatures. If I have a situation where I'm able to combine a small creature with lifelink with an equipment or something like that, and use multiple components in order to put a game plan together, that I find very satisfying. Or having those moments where you think, well, I'm about to lose this race. My opponent can block my small creature with lifelink, but either way I gain the life, and just having that opportunity to get that one-shot lifelink from that attack is enough to tip the race in a favorable balance. There are a lot of fun decisions that can surround it, and, maybe also if it's just in an environment where you're less focused on a player that is, trying to draft this aggressive burn deck and just really cannot beat you if you end up gaining 6 life.
Well, coincidentally, actually, that's where I think lifelink is more interesting. So I don't like it in the Bun Magic cube, where my definition of that cube is that it's a fair cube. Every deck has to care about the board. You have to care about card advantage. You have to care about tempo. And I don't want a bunch of prior decisions to be negated by a kind of snowballing play like lifelink very often is in those contexts. Hello, it's Andy from the editing booth. I foresee a bunch of feedback on my opinion on lifelink, and I wanted to clarify this one point in particular because listening back to it, I don't think it's abundantly clear. What I mean here is I don't like it when prior decisions are made to not have mattered. Like, the decisions you made turns out were completely inconsequential, and you only realize that when your opponent does something later on that makes all those decisions completely null and void. Which is different than something that actually negates or offsets or counters those decisions. So, for example, comparing it to a board wipe, you could say, playing a board wipe just negates all the creatures that is played in the earlier turns of the game. That I'm totally okay with because, the reason that your opponent played that board wipe is partially because you played those creatures. There was a back and forth between your actions and your opponent's reactions. And a board wipe is a card that your opponent has to have built a specific deck to take advantage of because it's a symmetrical effect that would also destroy their creatures. How are they going to take advantage of that symmetry and break it in their favor? Compared to just a big creature with lifelink, which really has no cost to put in your deck. I mean, presumably if it's a good enough card in the cube, then you would just play it. And your opponent was going to play their creature with lifelink whether you attacked or not on previous turns, right? And then you just find out that your attempt to make this game about a race, about, maybe on a prior turn, attacking it and sacrificing an attacker to get a couple of extra points of damage in, turns out that just didn't matter. It was irrelevant. You just didn't know this game wasn't about that at all because now it's just about you need a removal spell for that creature, or the question of who's the beatdown, the race, is just completely irrelevant. Hopefully that explains it a little better. And I'm curious, actually, to hear in the comments if you think there are other things in Magic that have that kind of effect of retroactively making decisions pointless. there I want you to be rewarded for making a attack that sacrifices a couple creatures to get the last couple points of damage in so that you can top deck your burn spell, which are not super abundant in that cube. I don't go over the top in terms of supporting like burn spells that can hit your opponent's face. In the Neoclassical cube, there is a burn deck, and I love having lifelink creatures there as a sideboard card against the burn deck and saying, yeah, here's the thing you have to answer, because that environment is so much more about having much more varied strategies that your answers are going to be more narrow and specific to, as opposed to the Bun Magic cube, where I do want every deck to care about the same kind of things. I don't know if that makes any sense or if that's coherent, but that is where I found lifelink to make sense for me. And I also just like Exalted Angel. It's a cool card.
Yeah, I mean, I think that environment
doesn't technically have lifelink, I have to say. Someone's going to correct me in the comments. It has a triggered ability when it deals damage, you gain life. It's not lifelink.
I get what you're saying. I feel like that also is an environment that is just, you're much more tolerant and you set the expectation. I guess that's the really important part of games are going to be a little bit swingy. Sometimes your opponent's just going to like have
more
a sequence that's going to be really hard to answer, and sometimes flipping up the big creature with almost lifelink is going to create that game that has that sort of like that race that you can't win, but you just have the expectation that that's going to happen. That feels more natural.
Did you watch Greg's video of him playing the Neoclassical
Not yet.
cube?
It's on my list.
The first match in Greg's video, which I'll put in the show notes, is a great example of what's possible in that environment. His opponent, on turn 1 both games, plays Library of Alexandria, and then ends up doing something with Library of Alexandria I've never seen, which is that in the mid-game...
You animated it with Kamal
No,
and
I did that.
With it?
I did that and killed somebody with Library of Alexandria. In this game, their opponent, somewhere in the mid-game, time spiraled into a full hand, then played Mind Over Matter, then they just discarded their own... They used Mind Over Matter to repeatedly untap Library of Alexandria to just find whatever cards they needed in their deck.
That's very cool.
It was so cool, but also you're like, Greg's just sitting over there like, well, if I get another turn, maybe I can do something for like 10 minutes. And then he's like, oh, I guess I get Brain Geysered for 40. I guess I don't get another turn.
The feeling of, I was playing against somebody and I had exactly that feeling of, oh, if I get another turn, I might have it out. And then they shuffle, what's the extra turn spell that shuffles?
Oh, Nexus of Fate.
Nexus of Fate. They shuffle Nexus of Fate and they like cast Nexus of Fate. And I'm like, oh, right. I don't get another turn because you just top deck Nexus of Fate again.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's always fun when that happens.
Anyway, yes, I have more tolerance for some nonsense in that cube. And yeah, having a big lifelink creature against a like aggro deck is some nonsense. So there's more tolerance for that there. Let's move on to C tier, though. I only got one thing in C tier. You said you have 5.
I have 5.
Maybe we're a little bit miscalibrated, but let's go to your...
Maybe you were miscalibrated.
I'm sorry, I've made a lot of tier lists, so I don't...
I've thought about Magic the Gathering keywords a lot.
Okay.
And a lot of them are Cs. So we've already talked about Hexproof and Indestructible, which I'm, again, more tolerant of them, but it really depends on the individual cards they're put on and the frequency of them. You know, if you were able to have a constructed format that was just dominated by these keywords, that would be awful. But
so just to recap, you have Protection in the bottom. You're the lowest tier of yours.
I think Protection
is
below
D.
these.
Then you have Hexproof Indestructible
right above them.
So we're in agreement, just a little bit off.
For all the reasons we talked about. And I also think, again, those are things that function really well on temporary effects or effects that have some way of getting around them. Like you can put a lot of riders on those that make them a useful keyword for the design team to have. And they're easy to understand. I'm okay with them, given a million caveats at C level.
The C stands for caveat.
Caveat. Death Touch is also in here. Again, I see a lot more utility for it in small doses, but I agree, like, the worst case of Death Touch is really kind of not my favorite kind of gameplay. Same with Lifelink. The last one that I have here that we haven't talked about is Vigilance.
Wow, so we actually, like, aside from just scaling, completely agree. If we were just to rank these in order without any, like, sense of where they're bunched on the, like, scale, we would have been in almost complete agreement so far.
Perfect. 10-minute episode. Vigilance. I think Vigilance... Again, I see why it's there. It makes sense in small doses, but it really kind of feels like one of the mechanics that can create the most frustrating board states where your opponent, I love mechanics that ask you to make some investment and have some trade-off, and just to say, no, my creature attacking doesn't have this trade-off anymore. Again, logically makes sense in small doses, but is just kind of takes out something that's interesting, and... A lot of the cards that have Vigilance, I feel like in older Magic, there would be still some other drawback so that you were still giving something up. Maybe it was an expensive creature that was only a 2/4, so you were having this game plan of I'm going to chip in slowly while doing this control plan. But when you just have a 3-mana 3/3 Vigilance, suddenly that just leads to not the kind of dynamic gameplay that I'm interested in. At that point, I'm just going to draft flyers.
Vigilance is my only thing in the C tier as well. It's the only one I have here. It's above all the things I mentioned in D tier for me. But this started because of the Vigilance Haters Club, and I think that they discovered that this thing, which I think maybe the perception was that everyone kind of likes, or it's very common, it's like a core part of Magic, it's like accepted.
Suddenly it became okay to say the quiet part out loud.
It became okay to say Vigilance is not great. And yeah, I think Vigilance is very polarizing. There are more cards I like with Vigilance, certainly, than any of the other mechanics I've mentioned so far. But taking away that decision of, like, the race is such an interesting part of Magic, and Vigilance, very much like Lifelink, honestly, kind of completely negates the race in a way that I think is just narrowing to the decision space, right? Like, it's not a decision anymore if you attack with your Vigilance creature. The same way it's not a decision anymore if you attack with your Lifelink creature. You could be on 1 life. It's still almost always correct to attack with your Lifelink creature because then you're guaranteed to gain that life instead of just waiting for them to draw a removal spell. And just having these, like, free decisions, obviously they can have a big enough board state they can block the Vigilant creature or double block it or whatever, but compared to the same creature without Vigilance, or realistically the same creature with some other upside, because if it's balanced in a way that Vigilance is being treated as a benefit, then there'd be something else in there at that mana value and power and toughness to make it make sense. Yeah, I think it is not my favorite mechanic either.
Again, I mean, just to throw out a couple caveats, or like context moments where I think it does make a lot of sense. I'm trying to separate, does Sarah Angel really appeal to me just because it is so iconic, or is it kind of this reward for, I got to this point where I'm casting my big flying angel, and now it is, like, protecting me while it's also...
It's the Baneslayer Angel of its day.
Yeah.
In our friend Alex's cube, the oldest school, which is a old-fashioned environment that, the rule he said for it is that it can play 0 cards that are good enough for the neoclassical cube. That was, like, the context under which he started making this cube. In that cube, Sarah Angel is still a huge bomb, and it feels like casting Baneslayer Angel. It feels exactly as good, and it does the exact same thing to the game, which is to say your opponent just shrugs and says, I don't have a removal spell, so I lose. So yeah, I have a lot of affection for it as like an iconic Magic design, but what it actually does to games is either it is bad because there's a lot of Doomblades running around, and then it's just a trap and you shouldn't do it, or it's really strong, and in a way that kind of negates a lot of your opponent's decisions in terms of what they can attack with.
I was actually a little bit curious, and so I'm just looking at my own main cube.
I'll say you started typing a whole bunch and stopped listening to me, so it must be something interesting over there.
I'm still listening, and so far it seems like my intuition matches up with my behavior of the cards that I put in my cube. There's more things with Vigilance than I expected in here, but of, like, you know, Protection, Indestructible, Hexproof, Death Touch, there are a number of, you know, combat tricks and things that grant these temporarily. There is Baleful Strix, one little Death Touch guy.
Which, I'll be honest, I'll say it now.
Oh, no. You don't have to say it. We don't have to say it. We can skip this part.
Okay, I won't say it.
Great, thanks. There is more Vigilance than I remembered, but also it is kind of somewhat on... Sylvan Advocate, I really should just cut from this cube, huh?
It's strong.
That's your reward for playing green. You have a big butt guy.
So just to recap, in our C tiers and below, we both have Vigilance, Lifelink, Reach, Death Touch, Defender, Protection, Hexproof, Indestructible.
I do not have Reach yet.
I thought you said Reach earlier. Okay, we haven't gotten to your Reach yet. Okay, fair. So that's our one point of difference so far, aside from just a little bit of ordering and, you know, how strongly we hold our views. Let's move up to the ones that are in the positive half of the tier list. B tier.
Reach.
Is that your only one?
No, but it's the first one.
Okay. I have only one in B tier as well, just like I only have one in C tier.
All right, I've got 4 here, actually. So, Reach... I get people's criticism of Reach, because flying is a thing, and I don't know if I'm totally into your terminology about orders of interaction, but, like, Reach only makes sense in the context of flying. It's like this answer. It's part of this conversation of, I have this mechanic. Well, here's another mechanic that does something about that one.
Now I have double flying.
A double hawk.
So, again, to me, it kind of... The volume of these things is important, but because I think in general there is enough flying in Magic, Reach doesn't feel weird for being a keyword that only makes sense when flying exists.
It's funny, that's not even really my criticism. Like, I get what you're saying, like, it's a keyword that literally doesn't matter at all unless there's a flying creature in play on the opposing side of the battlefield. I'm just saying, I think there are a million more interesting ways to deal with your opponent having a flyer in every color that we do not need Reach.
I just don't... I don't have the capacity to hate it. I'm just like,
That's
yeah,
fine.
here's just a little spider.
It's subjective.
Sometimes you just
It's
want
fine.
a little spider to keep you safe.
What else you got in B tier?
Defender. We already talked about Defender. Again, I feel like it's just like such a natural, obvious mechanic. I get that it's not splashy. It's maybe not going to create always the great kind of board states. Everything's going to depend on what the actual card designs are, but because it's just such a clear, intuitive mechanic, I'm going to leave it up here in B tier. I'm worried I'm going to get... Remember that my whole thing is scaled upwards from yours.
It sounds like yours follows more of like a bell curve.
Yes.
Mine's like an inverse bell curve. Okay. I only have 2 in the middle, and I have a bunch of things at the top and bottom.
I've got 2 more things in the B tier. I've got Ward. We talked about Hexproof. I think Ward is just a much more natural extension, plus the fact that it just opens up a ton of design space in terms of what does the actual Ward cost. I think this is just a great mechanic. And I think importantly, it's different from Protection in that Protection having lots of different sort of sub-variations is easy to miss because it's a static ability, whereas Ward, the actual like costs that are being imposed can actually be flavorful and resonant and create more interesting gameplay, whether it's not just a mana cost, it might be Ward, sacrifice a creature, or discard a card, or something that can be flavorful and interesting. So I think for flexibility and creating a lot of reasonable designs, Ward is B tier, solid mechanic.
Yeah, I think it's a lot better than Protection. Protection is a hard cutoff of something, and you can be narrow about what that something is, but it's always a hard cutoff to that thing. And Ward is, by design, always a soft cutoff. It is. You can always surmount it in some way, whether that's paying life, paying mana, discarding cards, and the flexibility in that cost, I think, makes it so much more appealing than Protection.
All right, moving up these keywords, so I'm realizing maybe my behavior doesn't match up with my intuition so well because I have like 2 creatures with Ward, no creatures with Defender, and very few creatures with Reach in my cube.
That's because those are poo-poo butt mechanics.
B mechanics, and there's plenty of A's and S's we can use. The last one I have here is actually First Strike. First Strike, I think, is a solid mechanic. Again, B tier, nothing to complain about, but I think in similar ways to some of the complaints you've had about Death Touch, I think especially having a lot of First Strike can lead to really unfun blocking positions or attacking positions where you just can't attack into multiple First Strike creatures. So I think that, again, it's like it works well, it plays well, but the volume has to be appropriate for it to really be fun.
I think the thing I'm most surprised by is your separating of First Strike and Double Strike into different tiers.
I know.
We'll get to that when we get to my First Strike, though, I guess. I only have one thing in B tier, and it's not something you've mentioned yet. It's Flash.
Cut that.
No, I am not going to cut that. I'm going to clip that is what I'm going to do.
I was not warmed up for that.
I'm going to clip that is what I'm going to do. I have Flash here, which I think might be somewhat surprising to some people. Flash, as a player, in the right deck, is incredible. I love playing with it. It's so satisfying to hold up counter magic, hold up removal, and then just flash in my threat at the end step if I didn't need to spend that mana using a interactive spell. But in the same way that, like, Vigilance feels good as a player because I get to attack and not have to worry about whether or not my creature is tapped to block, it does just make a lot of decisions not matter anymore, right? Like, now I don't have to ever think about if I'm going to spend my mana during my main phase and then, risk going shields down for a turn or only holding up 1 counterspell instead of 2 or whatever. I just get to do it all. And while I think people's intuition about Flash might be that it's like more flexible because it lets you cast the creature at more times and that means that it's more flexible, the reality is that you're only supposed to cast it at very specific times, and that's either to ambush an attacker or to flash it in an end step once you realize you have nothing else to do with your mana. I think it actually kind of narrows the decision space in a way because there are so many obvious ways to abuse it and no real cost.
Yes. So I really like Flash because it basically opens up a lot of design space for basically creatures with instant stapled to them, and outside of that, I agree it's not super interesting, but that is just like a lot of big design space, right?
I was surprised to find myself putting it here too a little bit. I was like, I do really kind of like viscerally feel like I like Flash in my bones. And it is a B tier, to be fair, but it's also just above Vigilance for me. We just talked about my concerns about Vigilance. I think it's pretty similar to Vigilance in a lot of ways in that it lets you do more, but in doing more, your decisions about where you have to actually use your resources are minimized. And I think decisions about where to use your resources are fundamentally what makes Magic interesting.
How do you feel about something like Shimmermer or Wrath Capuchin that allow you to cast other cards with Flash?
They both have Flash themselves as well.
And they have Flash, yeah.
I guess they're more interesting because it's interesting to recontextualize a creature's enter the battlefield ability that was not printed with Flash, now at instant speed. So I think that it's more interesting in that context for sure than just Yiva Nature's Herald or whatever, which actually that does give green creature spells
Flash.
All
your green creatures Flash.
Then just quick think of a vanilla thing with Flash.
But Wolf.
Brazen Borrower, actually, like I think Flash works better on Brazen Borrower because it can only block flyers, so you are not often doing that thing. Plus, it's also telegraphed because
you're often casting the adventure first.
Yeah, so again, there's a lot of cards in Flash I like, but if I'm honest with myself and I'm looking at it compared to all these other mechanics, it's the only one I felt like belonged in B tier for me. That leaves 7 for me between S and A tier. How many do you have total in S and A tier?
6.
Okay. Give me your A tier.
All right, my A tier is Haste. Perfect. Solid. Not outstanding.
Okay.
Trample. Exactly the same descriptors. Flash I have here at A tier, which I think maybe you've talked me down a little bit, but I'm locked in already, so we got Flash.
I mean, you've got Defender at B tier, so don't you dare put Flash down there with Defender.
You're right. I did this perfectly. Flash is so much better than Reach or Defender, so this is perfect. It's almost as if I should leave First Strike at B tier and move some of these down to C. It's almost like that.
Almost.
We're not going to do that.
Maybe just keep moving them down to D and add an F.
We're just going to be fine. We're gonna let these ride. I mean, like Trample and Haste, I think are perfect mechanics. They just add more texture to combat and let you do slightly different things. I do feel really similar about Haste, that it only makes sense, I think, more actually with Haste than focused on a certain volume. It being focused in a certain color really sort of informs how you sit down to a game of Magic and you're like, oh, my opponent's playing red, I'm going to protect my life total a little bit more and leave up more blockers if I'm at a low life total. That makes sense. If everything had Haste, then nothing would really have Haste, and you'd lose a lot of the texture of the games of Magic. And I think that's absolutely true with Trample as well. If everything had Trample, the games actually just wouldn't make that much sense. So that's why these are my A's. The last one I have here is Double Strike, which I actually do like a lot more than First Strike, even though it is similar in so many ways, but it also has this additional level of offering the player a promise of combine me with something, put a +1/+1 counter on me, give me some equipment and I will work so much better, or give something else that has a saboteur ability Double Strike and you can double up on it. Like, I think it's just a mechanic that has aspirations in a way that First Strike doesn't. So it's less clean and classic than Haste and Trample, but I think it also just is a lot more fun to play with.
Very similar A tiers here. I have First Strike and Double Strike here. I do have First Strike below Double Strike in A tier for the reasons you mentioned, but I also think putting a +1/+1 counter on your First Strike creature is very
half as
good.
cool.
Is very
literally
good.
half as cool.
The thing about Double Strike is that the cards it's put on, because it is so powerful,
they are very delicately balanced.
You
usually
often have like a Feast or Famine kind of thing.
Yeah, that is true.
With Double Strike, where it's like, well, I can't put anything on it, so here's my 4-mana 1/3 or whatever, which still might be okay depending on the board state. Or you can't put stuff on it and it quickly becomes a problem, or a Lightning Rod for removal. But to me, that's kind of the same mechanic, and I like it. I think it's good. It does tend to favor blocking still a little bit. I mean, except for Double Strike. Well, I don't know. I think it works kind of equally both on attacking and blocking, unlike some of these other mechanics like Death Touch and Lifelink, which I feel like are so much better in one context than the other. And I think it actually makes for interesting combat decisions, as opposed to Death Touch, which on paper maybe you could explain reasons why it does, but in practice just eliminates all decision space.
Right.
I think there are decisions around First Strike and Double Strike, around double blocking and
using a burn spell after First Strike damage.
Sure. There's a lot of interesting stuff that can happen because of those mechanics. So I have those there. My other two in A tier are Haste and Trample, which are nearly perfect mechanics. I put them in A tier because you have a quibble about each of them. My quibble about Trample is that
Trample, when you get into the rules,
Trample actually gets pretty complicated in the rules, and that's my one quibble with it. I think it's just the way that it meshes with Magic's rules engine.
Specifically stuff that like increases damage dealt by 1 that has Trample, then some weird stuff happens, and also with First Strike and Death Touch, some funny things happen, which they tend to just not combine these abilities in ways that these come up, but still can every once in a while.
Yeah, so it's rare, but otherwise I think it is a nearly perfect mechanic, and great as like Green's answer to evasion, pretty much. And Haste, I think, is also nearly perfect. This, I do think, density does matter a lot, and I have definitely played cubes, and felt that my own cube in the past just all of a sudden had too many Haste threats in red, and it was just like, okay, now I feel like
you're just playing a turn ahead of me.
Well, it feels like the opponent is so punished for having like sorcery speed interaction, or like actually tapping out for a board wipe, and then it's like, haha, 2 haste creatures. It's like, you go shields down for 1 moment to like clear the board, and I just have 2 more things with haste. And so I have used it a little more sparingly and just been a little more conscious of how much I'm putting in, because of how punishing I think it can be to decks I do want to be successful. The biggest cut I made in this regard is when Phoenix of Ash was spoiled. I was a huge proponent of it. In the like eternal, powerful, vintage cube design space, everyone was saying, oh, it's not as good as any of the Rabble Masters. Why would you ever play it? And I was like, well, first of all, I don't want to play a bunch of cards that are effectively just Rabble Masters but different. But second of all, I think it's actually better in many, many, many board states. The combination of haste and the escape ability means this recursive, hasty creature just was a total nightmare for some decks to deal with, and I ended up cutting it because, the combination of flying, haste, and recursion was just a lot on that card. And haste was a big part of why it was a problem, because even if you had multiple answers for it, it was going to get to hit you before you could answer it a lot of the time. That only leaves S tier, Anthony. I've got 3 left.
I have 2.
So you're 2.
Oh man, so I don't think we've talked about my 2s, so you've got 1 extra here, which I could figure out, but I won't.
You could figure out. So we both have Flying and Menace up here.
Flying and Menace.
How are you ordering them?
Oh, I have to order them? Yeah. Menace and then Flying.
See, I think there's a really strong argument that is the order they should be in. But I'm putting Flying at the top.
Flying is just so iconic. It's so flavorful.
It's the most resonant ability by far, and so
not even close. And so, it's like one of the only things that they have to and are able to use the art direction in order to make the mechanic clear.
Yeah, it's the most resonant keyword ability by a wide margin. The argument for Menace over Flying, right, would be that Menace is to like ward as Flying is to hexproof, right? Like
yes.
You can never block the flying thing, and that is inherently less interesting. But I think having exactly 2 levels, right? Like if they added tunneling or
double
super flying or like outer space or whatever.
They do have double flying. It's just the creatures that or high flying. It's the creatures that can't block creatures without flying.
I guess that is kind of what that is. But if they had another level where it's like, all right, well now there's double flying, and double flyers can only be blocked by other double flyers.
Actually, horsemanship
is
horsemanship. Exactly.
Like, horsemanship sucks, right? Like, as soon as you add another layer, I think it gets really screwed up. I think exactly 2 layers is beautiful, it's elegant, and it's a great way to give so much depth and identity to different colors and different creatures with very minimal rules baggage. Some creatures can fly, some creatures can't, and that means some creatures just can't be blocked by others. And the fact that a flying creature can block a non-flyer, like it's not Shadow or whatever, like Shadow also sucks, to be clear. The fact that a flying creature can block a non-flyer, I think, is the perfect tension, because you want to attack with your flyer, of course, because it's evasive. They probably don't have a blocker for it. You can probably clear the way for it, but it's also a very good blocker, and so you have this like thing pulling you in both directions. I think it's just a perfect mechanic.
Yeah, I think actually the comparison to Shadow and Horsemanship makes me feel much better about where I'm putting Reach in my tier list, because for the most part, Magic just combat exists on these 2 layers. These 2 layers always matter. And as soon as you add these other types of effects that come up so rarely, if you had the analogous thing of Reach for Horsemanship or for Shadow, yeah, that would feel like a totally like throwaway, confusing mechanic that like, why does this one random card have it? But because flying kind of always matters in pretty much, I don't know if I want to say every game of Magic. Let's say
not even close.
Let's say every cube has some things with flying.
But it doesn't matter.
It matters in the Ornithopter cube if you put Colossus Hammer.
I was about to say, it doesn't really matter.
If you put Colossus Hammer on an Ornithopter.
But then...
Okay, but fundamentally, Magic almost always cares about these 2 layers of combat, and so Reach being a fundamental like way to interact with those layers. The layers meaning spatial layers.
Yeah, we're not talking about Magic layers. Reach is my least favorite thing about flying. I think Reach is the blemish on the perfect diamond that is flying. The fact that they saw fit to print Reach instead of just saying, no, this is how the game works. Some things fly. God damn it.
This is also how the game works. Some things don't fly as good as they thought they did.
No, those things don't have flying, and it's perfect. So Menace, then, I don't know that most people will put it this highly. This might be somewhat unique among you and I. I haven't looked. I posted the link to this tier list in the Discord, and I'm going to post this in the show notes too, so you can go fill out this tier list for yourself and then share it on social media or whatever. I feel like if we were to look at the average placement of Menace, it would not be S tier, and yet here we are both putting it S tier.
Yeah.
It's a perfect evasion mechanic.
I mean, I was not questioning it because we both put it here, but you're probably not wrong. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have the iconicness. It doesn't necessarily have the resonance of Trample and Haste, but I think it does just like it's a mechanic that has actually been through many subtle iterations.
So many iterations. Fear and Intimidate and all the other non-named versions of the similar kinds of effects.
And it just ends up playing really well. And I think that the other thing that you said that this doesn't have is it doesn't have that feast or famine experience where Double Strike is cool, but it really depends on individual card designs, and designs can really fall flat or feel like super swingy. Menace never really has those issues. It's just, it is like a bread and butter mechanic
marginal upside
that is slightly better.
Yeah. It's a marginal upside that you can make better, right? Like giving your menace creature a +1/+1 counter or an ability like does really matter a lot of the time. But yeah, the fail case is you're not paying that much more for the keyword. Whereas like Double Strike, you're paying a lot more for Double Strike because the ceiling is crazy high. Menace is a pretty marginal upside, much smaller than flying. I'm sure if we like looked at the French vanilla test or whatever.
And it just like plays well with a lot of the other things that are happening in combat. Having your menace creature attack and holding up a combat trick, very cool. And having combat tricks that grant menace is even interesting, where now you're doing that at sorcery speed, obviously, because you have to do it before your opponent blocks, but you're asking your opponent to make this decision. Is it worth double blocking this thing that maybe you otherwise wouldn't want to? So, yeah, I mean, menace, I think, is just solid mechanic.
Rounds out the evasion pie, right? Where you have flying in mostly blue and white, and you have trample in mostly green, a little bit in other colors. Then you have menace in mostly black and red.
I believe that. That sounds right.
Listener at home, have you sorted out what my last S tier mechanic is, which I actually put between flying and menace? I have it being better than menace. It's Ward. I think Ward is fantastic. I have said this on the show before, but it opens up so much design space for creatures that don't have to have an enter the battlefield ability to be decent against removal. Before we got Ward, we either had hexproof creatures, we had Muldrifters, cards that, are not even worth removing at all because you've already gotten all the value out of it. And we had Baneslayers, cards that, of course, you're going to remove it, and then your opponent is just, like, totally screwed because they had their threat removed. But once you're, like, casting threats that cost more than the average removal spell in an environment, you really have to have one of those things, or you're messing up. And Ward allows for so much more depth in the space of what a creature can be in the face of a removal spell. The varied costs are amazing. I think Ward 1 and Ward 2 are amazing. Ward 4 is a little bit silly on something like Kappa Cannoneer. Like, okay, that's, you're basically writing Ward Infinity there. That's a lot. But still surmountable. You can still get to 5 mana for your Swords to Plowshares to work if you want. But Ward discard a card, Ward pay life, Ward sacrifice a creature. All of these things, I think, are fantastic mechanics. And I'm really glad that it became instant evergreen, which is something I would not expect to say about a lot of the new things coming out of Wizards, but I think Ward is basically perfect. I have no notes on it.
I mean, it is funny that you're saying it's basically perfect, but one of the things that makes it perfect is it has a lot of knobs to turn, and they can turn those knobs to perfect. Like, would you be as happy if it was just Ward 1, or Ward just meant pay 1 extra mana?
I'd be very happy with that, but not as happy as I am with Ward discard a card and, all these other more novel Ward costs.
Because you could just write hexproof as, like, Ward, you lose the game.
You could do that.
That'd be fun.
You could be very pedantic and impractical. Yes, you could do that.
So despite our tier charts being pretty much in line, so what are the big differences? You put Ward way higher than I did, which I don't disagree with. It's just maybe complexity is doesn't have the classic feel that's going to put it in A or S tier mechanic for me.
And then Region Defender, you had a couple tiers higher than I did. But besides that, I think we're kind of in line here with more or less how we feel about this. And the patterns I noticed are all the evasive things are way up top. All of the, like, only good when blocking or massively better when blocking things are way at the bottom. I was a little surprised to see you put protection and hexproof and indestructible so low because you do love being safe. It's one of your favorite things in Magic. And you do have way more...
But it only matters when it's the exception. Right? I just want to be safe. I don't want everybody else to be safe. So we can only have so much safety.
I don't think we're ever arguing that like every creature should have any of these abilities. But yeah, I mean, what is there to say about the fact that we put so many of the
cube, we make indestructible cube, and suddenly
that's so dumb.
Horsemanship and shadow become the most important abilities, so you can get around everybody's blockers.
Well, it's just all you did was just say, okay, now we only play exile removal. It's like it's the same cube. You did nothing.
Yes, you're right.
But what does it say about the fact that we put all of the aggressive and evasive mechanics up top and all of the defensive and game prolonging? I mean, I knew this about myself. I didn't quite know this about you. But is it just that Magic inherently benefits the defender so much that the things that lead to interesting games of Magic are the things that encourage you to attack, that push against that natural tide of you are advantaged when blocking and disadvantaged when attacking. And so is that what it comes down to?
Or is it just a psychological failure that I get excited about the mechanics, that I think about, oh, I'm winning the game now because I'm attacking you with my guy with double strike?
But you just said you get excited about being safe, not about winning the game. You're the tooth and nail for Archetype of Endurance and Avacyn Angel of whatever.
Angel of Hope.
Guy. That's you.
It's true. Yeah, but that's not really talking about a vanilla creature so much as...
I don't know. I hadn't thought about this right now. I'm just spitballing, but maybe there's something to the fact that Magic really does benefit the defensive player naturally in the mechanics of the game. The fact that you get to line up blockers how you want. Your opponent doesn't get to decide how you block. The fact that you then get to have the information of what your opponent has attacked with and what is tapped to decide how you want to counterattack or how you want to spend your mana on your turn. Like, those are real benefits to the defensive player that are just, I think, entrenched in the mechanics of the game. So I think having abilities on creatures that largely push the other direction to increase that tension, to give you a strong motivation to attack, are maybe just inherently better.
Or we could be massively wrong, and you could be like,
I really doubt
here's
that.
an environment where we've
smart.
adjusted to what you thought's the best, and you play it, and it's like, oh, this sucks now. There was some important sauce and some important balancing that you're not thinking about.
Yeah, if only somebody would make some sort of way for us to play an environment where there was no death touch and very little defender and reach and whatever. Yeah, this is my cubes. I've been doing this for years. I have played this environment, and I think it rules.
Okay. I think also it's maybe interesting that, like, I put death touch and lifelink pretty low in here, and it's not that I hate them. It's just I really do think they work well in very small doses, whereas flying, you could have 10% of a cube, 15, 20% of the environment flies, and it would still mostly work.
It's actually honestly better when you have a more healthy...
Right.
It's not great when you have like 3 flyers in the cube, and then they just basically have unblockable. Like, the mechanic inherently is tuned to whatever the environment is. Right.
And similar with trample and haste, I think it's important that those are focused in slices of the color pie, so you sort of know what to expect from different opponents or out of different matches, but I do think you can also tolerate a large amount of that in an environment where you can't necessarily with some of those others. So, I mean, yeah, it's just like having too much hexproof just sucks, but like
any
one or two?
No, it's still awful. F tier.
F tier for favorite cube of Andy's, not...
I'm curious to see what everyone else does for their tier lists. I haven't looked at any of the ones posted in the Discord yet because I didn't want to taint my perspective before going into this episode recording, but I'm going to go check it out now. And like I said, the link to this tier maker tier is going to be in the show notes, so you can fill it out yourself, post it on your Twitter or whatever. And when you do post it on your Twitter, share a link to the episode, please. I'm doing engagement farming. But for real, we don't advertise or anything, so that's the only way the show grows if you tell people you like it and they should listen to it.
But we also don't benefit if the show grows, so...
Sure we do. Massive influence.
Yes, a warm, fuzzy feeling directly
Line go
in
up.
my gut.
Line go up. The other thing I'll say about this is I'd be very curious to see what a commander player would do with these same mechanics. Because I get the sense that a lot of things like, does menace matter at all in Commander? I feel like it can't possibly.
No, I don't think so.
First strike, does that matter at all in Commander? Probably not. But some other things like hexproof, flash are going to matter so much. But mattering is not one-to-one with how much you actually like them. So if you're a Commander player, make your Commander-focused keyword tier list, and let's argue about it. That is it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you for tuning in. If we get anything wrong this episode about any card mechanics, we did that on purpose, just to farm engagement. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by thinking really hard about keyword abilities, and then speaking into microphones about it. Anthony, thank you for the gift of friendship and for the gift of Cube.
Andy, thank you for the gift of friendship and the gift of Cube. Could I ask you for one more gift?
Sure.
Could we hear your best Flash Gordon intro?
I don't know what Flash Gordon is. If you play it for me...
Homework for next week.
If you play it for me, I'll do it. Here, wait. Let's see. I didn't know what you did when you just went... Whoa!
Yeah, that was great. You did it. Excellent. All right, and on that bombshell.
Flash Gordon videos... Flash Gordon theme song?
Yeah.
Will you destroy this Earth?
Later. I like to play with things a while before annihilation.
Oh, this racist.
What?
It's not great. That's definitely a white guy.
It's not great.
Is this a movie about a quarterback saving the universe?
Sure. I think he's more of a superhero.
He's a quarterback, it looks like. Anyway, we're done.
So you're not gonna...
Flash!
Yeah, that's much better.
Savior of the universe!
Great.